CNN.
Hello everyone, live from CNN in New York, I'm Zain Asher. Tonight, at his year-end press conference, Vladimir Putin reiterates his demands over NATO expansion and Ukraine, saying that NATO has broken its promises. Some potentially good news about Omicron, as studies show the rate of hospitalization is much less than with the Delta variant. And I'll speak to the artist whose Tiananmen Square sculpture has just been removed from a Hong Kong university. We'll get to all the COVID news in just a moment, but first, more tough talk today from Russian President Vladimir Putin as Moscow and NATO square off over Ukraine. Mr. Putin says that he's encouraged that NATO wants to negotiate, but he's also making clear what he wants: ironclad assurances of security. Mr. Putin held a year-end news conference that went on for hours. He reiterated his demand that NATO needs to guarantee it will never expand further eastward. And he blasted the US and NATO for inching closer and closer to Russia over the years, accusing the West of deception.
How would the Americans react if we placed our missiles on the border between Canada and the United States or on the Mexican border? Not a single inch to the east, they told us in the 90s. And what do you know? They cheated. They just deceived us blatantly. 5 ways of NATO expansion. And there you go. Now in Romania and Poland, weapon systems appear.
The crisis has sharply escalated in recent months as Russia masses forces on the Ukrainian border. Mr. Putin hasn't said if he intends to invade. CNN's Melissa Bell has been following the Russian leader's news conference for us from Moscow. So it was a 4-hour news conference. Melissa, just walk us through what else he said.
Well, he was asked directly that very important question, Zain, the one that's been on the mind of so many people as they've watched that Russian troop build-up along Ukraine's border these last few weeks, as they've watched those growing tensions around the country, as they've watched that escalating rhetoric on both sides, the Russian but also on NATO with those threats of sanctions, the question of what exactly Vladimir Putin plans to do. He was asked directly, would Russia invade Ukraine? The answer was fascinating. It was not so much to do with the negotiations that we expect to start in January, although we have heard just in the last hour or so from the White House press secretary that the idea that those would be held in Geneva has yet to be confirmed, despite what Vladimir Putin said in his press conference. He said the question of whether Russia would choose to invade was not so much a function of how those negotiations went, but whether the West would accept those full-scale Russian proposals, namely that NATO should commit to not expanding eastwards, also that it should roll back essentially to pre-1997 lines when it didn't have either weaponry or manpower in those countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, like Romania, where it currently has them. But bear in mind that we've been hearing the reply to that over the course of the last few days. These Russian proposals have now been on the table for several days now. We've heard the head of NATO saying, look, the era of spheres of influence is gone. We'd heard also from the US's top diplomat to Europe saying that some of those demands were clearly unacceptable to NATO, although everyone is welcoming those discussions. And what we've heard in the last hour or so from Jen Psaki is that, of course, dialogue is what everyone is seeking. Again, repeating that some of the demands are unacceptable, but also saying, look, it's important to note that despite what Vladimir Putin had to say today in that press conference, the only aggression, she said, has been coming from the Russian side. Also pointing out that as far as NATO is concerned, and despite those warnings that were given today during that press conference by Vladimir Putin of the fact that as NATO has inched eastwards, Russia is now concerned about what that might mean for Ukraine. That is weaponry potentially on Russia's doorstep. Jen Psaki pointed out, look, NATO is a defensive organization. It is not an aggressive alliance, and really giving the White House's view. So you see there is this great chasm, Zain, between the two sides, and it's very difficult to see the basis on which any constructive conversations can have place. That they are happening, that they will take place, is of course welcomed by everyone. But as we move forward, it's very difficult to see on what basis anyone's going to be able to agree, Zain.
Yeah, there's so many sticking points. Melissa Bell, live for us there Thank you so much. A short time ago, as Melissa was just saying there, the White House responded to Mr. Putin's comments, saying it will never agree to some of Mr. Putin's demand. I want to bring in Natasha Bertrand for that side of the story. So, Natasha, Vladimir Putin clearly blaming the West for this build-up in tensions. What has the White House had to say about that?
Yeah, Zane, so a senior administration official briefed reporters on this very subject earlier this morning and reiterated essentially everything they have said previously, which is that Russia has made these security demands of the U.S. and of NATO, but that many of those demands are things that Russia itself knows that the U.S. is not willing to accept. And so while there are certain things, the official did not elaborate on what those things are, that they are willing to discuss with Russia as soon as January in multiple different forums. There are other things that are just simply non-starters. And so this has given rise to many fears by U.S. officials that Russia is perhaps putting this out there as a pretext for an attack on Ukraine, for an invasion, saying that their demands were not met and therefore they have to protect their own security. But the U.S., again, saying that they are willing to negotiate. They do still see a window here to deter a potential Russian invasion because they do not believe that Vladimir Putin has actually made a decision yet to invade, and therefore there is some time here for diplomacy. But at the same time, they are weighing all of their options. Again, the administration official telling reporters earlier today that in conjunction with U.S. allies, with the Europeans, with NATO, they are prepared to impose very severe, harsh consequences on Russia if it does move to invade Ukraine. Those include economic penalties like very harsh sanctions, and they also include the possibility that NATO capabilities will be moved much closer to Russia, which of course is the opposite of what Russia has wanted to see. So they're laying out kind of the carrot and the stick here, saying that if Russia comes to the table, then they are willing to discuss some of their concerns with regard to the security, but also they're willing to act and fast if Russia does move to invade.